Air Force One stopped in Alaska on the way to Beijing. The president was on board. Elon Musk was on board. And somewhere on a tarmac in Anchorage, Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, was waiting to get on the plane.
President Trump arrived in Beijing for his highly anticipated summit with China's Xi Jinping. Accompanying the president are several of the most high-profile business and tech CEOs, some of which traveled with him on Air Force One.
Top U.S. business leaders joined President Trump in China, including Elon Musk, Tim Cook, and Nvidia's Jensen Huang, who was added at the last minute. What it means for U.S.-China ties.
That is not how presidential travel normally works. You do not collect CEOs in Alaska en route to a state visit, unless the semiconductor executive has something very specific that he needs from the trip. 17 CEOs flew to Beijing this week alongside the president. Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jensen Huang. The South China Morning Post called it a $1 trillion business delegation. That number is not an exaggeration, and every single one of them had a very specific reason they needed to be there. This is not a story about diplomacy. It is a story about money, specifically about where American companies make their money and who controls the conditions under which they are allowed to make it. Here is the story most of the coverage is telling. Trump and Xi met to manage a complicated relationship. Trade tensions, tariffs, Taiwan, Iran.
President Trump and China's Xi meet face-to-face in Beijing, but on Taiwan, the divide is unmistakable. Will Taiwan be a bargaining chip in a deal between Washington and Beijing?
The kind of geopolitical gravity that requires heads of state to sit across from each other in the Great Hall of the People and talk for hours. That framing is backwards. The CEOs are not there because the president invited some business leaders along for a photo opportunity. They are there because each of them has a specific number. A dollar amount of business, a license they need approved, a restriction that is costing them measurably, and the only place in the world where those numbers can be fixed is in a room with Xi Jinping. Start with Jensen Huang, because his case is the most dramatic. In April 2025, the US government banned the export of Nvidia's H20 chip to China. The H20 had been specifically designed to comply with earlier export restrictions, a deliberately limited version of Nvidia's AI hardware, engineered to be sellable in China without triggering national security concerns. The ban took it anyway. Nvidia took a $5.5 billion charge. Huang later told investors the ban had cost Nvidia $15 billion in sales. He described it as deeply painful. He also said the Chinese AI market is worth $50 billion a year, and that Nvidia had been cut out of it entirely. During the Beijing summit, the US cleared Nvidia to sell its H200 chip to 10 specific Chinese companies. Each approved buyer can purchase up to 75,000 chips. At roughly $27,000 per chip, that is a theoretical market of over $2 billion per customer. Here is the problem. The US has approved the sales. China has not. Chinese firms have pulled back from confirming orders, apparently under guidance from Beijing. Not a single H200 has been delivered. Huang flew to Alaska and boarded Air Force One for a potential $50 billion a year market. He left Beijing with a partial approval and a situation that is still unresolved. Tim Cook's situation is structurally different, but the dollar amounts are comparable. Apple generated $64.4 billion in revenue from Greater China in fiscal year 2025, roughly 15 to 20% of total revenue. Apple has been spending heavily to diversify manufacturing out of China, now making approximately 25% of iPhones in India. But even Indian-assembled iPhones depend on Chinese components. The supply chain is a network of thousands of suppliers that cannot be replicated on any near-term timeline. Cook flew to Beijing with 64 billion reasons per year to make sure that network stays intact. Elon Musk's case is the most concentrated. The Shanghai Gigafactory produced 851,000 vehicles in 2025, 52% of Tesla's entire global output. It is also the key site for mass production of the Optimus humanoid robot. The Shanghai factory is not just where Tesla makes cars, it is where Tesla's future is being manufactured. Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg flew with a simpler ask: orders. Trump announced that China had agreed to buy 200 Boeing aircraft, valued at between $17 and $25 billion. But China has not publicly confirmed the order. The original expectation was 500 aircraft, and Boeing shares fell 4% on the news. Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, Citigroup, MasterCard, and Visa all made the trip because China's financial market is enormous, and they have been trying to get meaningful access to it for years with limited success. The individual CEO stories are each compelling, but they are all symptoms of a larger dynamic: two countries negotiating using their company's supply chains as leverage. China's card is rare earths. China mines more than 60% of the world's rare earth materials and processes more than 80%. In April 2025, China imposed export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements. Yttrium exports to the United States dropped from 333 tons in the 8 months before the restrictions to 17 tons after, a 95% reduction. Then, in November 2025, China suspended those controls for 1 year, a pause running precisely through the diplomatic window of this summit. The restrictions were not lifted because the problem was solved. They were suspended because leverage is most useful when withheld, not deployed. America's card is semiconductor chips. The H20 ban cost Nvidia $15 billion. It also set back Chinese AI development. China's domestic chip industry grew. Cambricon posted a 4,300% revenue jump as Chinese companies scrambled for alternatives, but it remains years behind Nvidia. The gap is large enough that the ban was genuinely damaging. Both countries held the other's industries hostage. The 17 CEOs in the room were, in a specific sense, the hostages made visible. Here is what the delegation actually reveals. 5 years of decoupling rhetoric has produced almost no actual decoupling. The US companies most dependent on China in 2021 are the ones most dependent on China in 2026. Apple still manufactures 75% of its iPhones there. Tesla's largest factory is there. Nvidia's most important growth market is there. Boeing's most significant customer base is there. You do not send 17 of your most powerful business leaders on a presidential trip to a country you are economically separating from. You send them to a country you are fundamentally, structurally dependent on. The results of the summit were underwhelming. The Boeing order was smaller than expected and unconfirmed. The Nvidia clearance was incomplete, with Chinese firms still not buying. Financial access was discussed but not granted. The constructive, strategic, and stable framework announced at the summit is diplomatic language for "we did not make things worse." This is not a failure of the trip. It is an accurate reflection of the relationship. Two countries that each hold the other's key industries hostage have limited incentive to simply let go. The leverage is the point. What changed in Beijing is that 17 of the most powerful people in American business flew to China and made their dependency visible. Jensen Huang flew to Alaska to board the president's plane. That is how much he needed to be in that room.